All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Tonya. So everyone should have a copy of the run-up show and agenda in front of you. There's a QR code that links you to the report. There are printed copies of that, so feel free to flip through those as we go through. I want to invite Camille Lloyd up to the stage. We're going to start off by talking about the report itself, Gallup, our partnership, and how we came to get this survey and report in front of you. So welcome, Camille. All right, good morning again.
Good morning, good morning.
So we are here at Gallup, and you lead what is known as the Gallup Center on Black Voices, which was our partner in completing this survey and report. Can you tell us both about Gallup and the center that you lead?
Sure. I'm excited that we're releasing the results here. It's so fitting. But the center is Gallup's research initiatives. In 2020, I think like most organizations, we contemplated on how do we want to do things differently. There was some series of self-interrogation, but really kind of from a research perspective, questioned about what would it look like if we were to do research at the organization that Gallup is, at the scale that we can do research, that centered the Black experience to try to understand and answer the question like, have we made progress? You know, like, as far as Black Americans' life, have we made progress? And every time you would talk to different experts, it would be, it depends. So it depends if you were talking to someone like Ambassador Young, who would go, well, we have come a very long way. We've made a lot of progress. There are, surveys on the wall that you see about how accepting Americans are and how much our perspectives have changed on certain things, but there was always a question. And so it says, what if we had a series of measures that we agree we're gonna track on a quarterly basis for the next 100 years? And so that's where the vision for the center came along to say, we're gonna report out and highlight the Black experience for the next 100 years to understand what progress looks like or lack thereof on some key measures, right? So we have 6 key research pillars. And across those 6 research pillars, we have measures that really just ask people, how's your life going? How are you interacting with systems? What are the opportunities that you have available to you? And importantly, which part of this leads into the work that we're doing with local communities, is what are your expectations for change? And so when we start to think about, where will change happen, we know that that's local. And so understanding resident voices is central to that process when we start to think about not just asking people about their experiences, but how are their lives going. We have to understand that in the context of where they live, rather than just like a national benchmark.
So let's get into the methodology. So we know that's an important aspect to any survey. So like who is surveyed, how people receive the survey, what language it's in. Can you walk us through the methodology that you all used for this survey and report?
Absolutely. There was a great deal of intention to say, how can we take what was done for the 2 previous administration of this survey and really kind of understand in an intentional way in how the foundation was structuring the work and the programming that it was leading, but to really also understand that we know, acknowledging that all residents in the region is not having the same experience, and so we needed to have a robust research approach that would allow us to unpack those nuanced experiences. And so, as a result, we increased the total number of survey sends, and we did disproportionate samples in areas that were identified as priority areas, and these are major community of colors, and it says we want to be able to represent and understand how people's lives are different within the region, because we do have a lot of data, as Tonya said, but a lot of that data is either boiled up overall or our inability to drill deeper at different, by different communities, or understanding the differences by race and ethnicity. And so for that reason, we decided to send out over 27,000 survey packets to homes, and we chose mailing. People might be like, well, why are you mailing? It's antiquated. It's to really so that we can increase the representation, not leave out segments of the population that we know are challenged as far as access to internet. And so as a result, sending out 27,000 surveys, intentionally sampling, so we can get enough completes from communities of colors, and particular in priority areas across the jurisdictions that we surveyed. And we sent the survey out in English and in Spanish. And then we got a little bit over a 10% response rate. So we're looking at over 2,800 residents who responded back to that survey. And so the magnitude of that survey is is taking an approach to want to be as inclusive as possible, but to also be as representative of residents as much as we possibly could in terms of this year's sampling.
And some of the things that folks will see in the report is, I think in the back, we have a section dedicated to the priority areas. And one of the things that stands out to me in the report is this finding that residents generally view the region as a great place to live. And we say that across jurisdictions, across demographic groups. But then when you look at the priority areas, and when you look by race and ethnicity even, you can see some really wide gaps. So when you look at LGBTQ individuals, I think it's 63% rate this as a great region to live, but then breaking that down by race, you see there's about 20 percentage point gap in that. Black LGBTQ individuals, only 55% say it's a good place to live. White LGBTQ individuals, 74%. Is that something that you see in other communities, or might that be unique in some way to this region?
I think we tend to do see some trends that are similar, but I think the magnitude at what we see the difference and how important it is for residents here is this idea of feeling like I belong in the community where I live. That's a particularly important driver and determinant of residents' overall well-being in the region, right? Feeling like where I live is a perfect place for people like me. And so when I look at that, in that importance of that sense of belonging or that particular item, understanding the gaps that we see with our LGBT community residents and others, it's not surprising, right? So do people feel like where they live is the perfect place for them in terms of do they belong, right? And how important that is to our residents and their ability to thrive.
So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about VoicesDMV in this report, our CEO, Tonya Wellens, always says that this should be a public good. We want people to use this report, not just to be a PDF that lives on a website, although you can access it on our website. But what are some ways that you've seen other communities really take information, data, findings, and spark change and do something with it? And what might you recommend for this community?
I think because we are in such a data-rich community, it's really hard to get agreement because the first thing is going to be like, well, what data are you using and what data do you have, and whether or not those are discrete data or you know them and sharing, we are the same unit of analysis, is the ability to use this data as a public good in its true sense, which is to generate collective action. If we all are in a choir and we all have the same sheet of music, then the idea of using it as accountability for change among those who are doing work, I think that that is particularly important. And now that you have like a common set of data that is centering residents' voices and their experiences, it's a perfect accountability mechanism. And that's what some communities that we're working with are trying to do, is getting all of those partners, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's nonprofit, whether it's government, in the room to say, we have a set of measures that people are telling us how their lives are going, what their challenges are. Can we agree that we're going to be intentional about moving the needle? And if we go back and measure and we see differences in people's experiences, then we know if what we're doing is working. And that's also a way we can keep ourselves accountable for change. I think it's a great tool for creating collective action if everybody agrees, okay, this is a sheet of music that we're going to be singing from, which are residents' experiences. We can't be saying things are great in the region, but then when you look at some numbers around economic precarity, especially in our priority areas, we see that there's a significant portion of our communities that are being left behind, that are still struggling to buy food, to pay for rent or mortgage, right? We still have, no matter how well we're doing as a region, if we don't understand who's being impacted negatively or who's being left behind, then we can't work together. And so I think the data is an important way to create collective action and create accountability among those who are doing the work to create change.
Right, and I appreciate that because it speaks to why it's so important with the data and the common language of disaggregating the data, looking at the priority areas, not just the region as a whole, which both are important, but sort of seeing the level of detail, looking at race and ethnicity. We also have some data broken down by age group, by income level, so that can help reveal this point about who's being left behind and what other work can be done. You've also done work around data and community voice in other cities, including Detroit. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you all have learned from Detroit and perhaps what this community might learn from what you've done in Detroit with their data?
I think for the Detroit was their acknowledgement of community building, requiring that we have to come together. There are tons of research resources that are available, but they were all looking at either different things or they had different units of analysis, so to speak. But nobody was coming together to say, well, let's share the data that we have, so it's not as open, or it wasn't as open in terms of the space and how data was available. So they created a data blueprint group, right? So it's like an amalgamation of all of the data providers and saying, hey, we're going to do this survey. It's going to be the first time we're going to be capturing resident voices at this level within the city. What question would you want to ask based on the things that you're prioritizing at your organization? And so getting those stakeholders up front based on what you're planning to invest in, right? So these are organizations that were either investing in advancing equity in the city, or were working directly, providing direct resident services. And it says, what would it look like if you could have a sense to understand how much your work is having an impact or not having an impact in the community? So I think that they kind of built up this we're gonna hold ourselves accountable to this measure up front. And I think that now that they have data, it's now that proof of concept time, right? So it's like giving it back to them to say, you said you were interested in education and access to education, and that's the type of work that your organization is funding. Here's what we know about what residents feel about education, right? Majority of residents with children in Detroit says, my child would be better off going to school elsewhere, right? And so what do you do with a finding like this? Well, what are those things that you're gonna put in place? Where are those residents sending their kids, or where do they live that feel this way, that the schools or the education system is not serving them well? So I think that's something that they did before they did their data collection, which is agreeing that they would all use the data, no matter what it said, to drive action within their individual organization.
So we're going to get into the report and the findings just throughout the rest of the morning with our next conversations, but I do want to give you the opportunity to share what's your big takeaway. I mean, there's so much information in the report. We have the printed report. We'll have an online interactive data dashboard where people can see it in their community in particularly. But for you, what were the big takeaways or any surprises?
You can't ask a data nerd that question, Darius.
What's your favorite?
What's your favorite? Well, all of it. It feels like all of it is my baby. But the most important finding, and I mentioned a little bit about, we didn't want to just measure all the struggles and challenges people were experiencing in the region. It was also very important for us, as Tonya mentioned, to understand well-being, residents' well-being, and what was driving residents' well-being. And seeing that 52%, so over half of the region's residents, are rating their lives in such a way that we would classify them based on our measurement as thriving, which means they rate their current lives well, but they also have high hope for the future, because we asked the question about in 5 years, where do you think your life will be? So understanding that we're 52% despite the challenges, right? There are 48% that are struggling. So I don't want to downplay the struggling, the suffering group, but understanding that there is still optimism. So despite of how people might be adversely experiencing life now, there's a great hope for the future. So that's one thing. So I think the positivity in terms of understanding that we do have a majority of residents that are thriving, but I think also the startling thing for me, at least the most interesting, was how much lack of agencies residents felt. We asked the question about how much influence you think you have on decision-making or local government, and the reason why that was surprising for me is, like, you would say we're sitting at the seat of power in this region, and residents do not particularly feel empowered or enabled to drive change in their communities. And so I think it was enlightening, because it was like, this is why this work is so important, right? By amplifying resident voices, you're democratizing that process for them, right? By including their experiences into those decision making. And so that was one of the ones that I was like, yes, this is why this is important.
And just one note on the piece about thriving, which you shared, is another reason why I think it's great, this partnership with Gallup, because that is a measure that you all have data on nationally. So we can see how this region is doing compared to the national average, which I think is around 51% thriving, whereas this region is 52%. 3 years ago, it was higher, and we've seen that this region is moving along with changes nationally, so that's really helpful information. Anything else you'd like to share from the report or the methodology?
The other thing is I talked about whether or not people feel like they belong where they live. I think it's also people's perspective on change and change in the region. How we see change clouds so much of what we think in terms of our optimism for the future. I mentioned about the overall well-being. If I think the changes that are happening in the region are going to benefit me or others like me, I'm much more optimistic about what my life will be 5 years from now. And so when we start to think about how we communicating the changes that are happening and how we communicating to residents what those benefits are to them, because that is very important to how people are seeing and rating their lives for the future. And that is particularly important because if you don't think the change is going to benefit you or people like you, you're less likely to be optimistic about the future.
Thanks, Camille.